All right, good afternoon. It's uh it's now 1:45, and they asked me to speak now for 45 minutes. So originally we planned to do this live at Nishmat, and then we would have had a much easier questions and answers session. Um, question and answers a bit hard on this format, but I'm still open to it. So I see that on the bottom of the screen, there's a place where a person can do chat, and you can feel free to write in any questions as I'm talking, and I'll see if I'm able to see those questions and get to an answer in them. So feel free to do that. If we don't get questions, I'll just keep talking. So what I want to start talking about, I wanted to go over a lot of the halachot of Seder night itself. And I thought I'd start with the mitzvah of matzah. Which is a mitzvah from the Torah. Now, it's very interesting. There are many mitzvot that we do on Seder night. In fact, the Vilna Gaon counted them up, and he got to, I think, 64. Some people add even more mitzvot. Once you start with the big ones like eating matzah and telling the story of leaving Egypt, drinking 4 cups, but then you add all the other ones that you don't even think about, like, so we're going to bench, we're going to say grace after meals. Well, that's another mitzvah. And we're going to do a lot of mitzvot on this night, getting up to more than 64 mitzvot, according to some calculations. But the biggest one has to be the big two special ones that are especially for this night, which are still from the Torah. One is eating matzah, and the other one is telling the story from Egypt, Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. We'll get to that a bit later if we have time. So the mitzvah of eating matzah tonight is a mitzvah that still applies from the Torah. The mitzvah of maror, of eating the bitter herbs, which when we have the Korban Pesach again, will become again a mitzvah d'oraita from the Torah, because as the Torah says, that you should eat the Korban Pesach on matzah and maror. So eating the Korban Pesach from the Torah involves also eating matzah and maror together with it. But today, when we don't have Korban Pesach, so we have a separate mitzvah to eat matzah in and of itself. Maror is a rabbinic mitzvah, because the rabbis wanted to make it even when we don't have Korban Pesach. But matzah has its own pasuk, be'erev tachlu matzot. In this night, you should eat matzah. So it's a mitzvah from the Torah, even in our day and age, even if we don't have Korban Pesach. The Khatam Sofer points out that this is the only food which we are still commanded to eat. That is, when we have a Beit HaMikdash, there are lots of foods that Kohanim are commanded to eat, that even us regular Jews are commanded to eat. Certain korbanot, certain truma, maisa. There are things that you have to eat as a Jew. But once the temple was destroyed and we now no longer had all those foods, the only food that has a command that it should be eaten is matzah. So this is it. You're doing that. There are other times when we're commanded to eat, but that's I am commanded to eat on Shabbos. I'm commanded to eat in a sukkah. But that there's a certain food that I'm commanded to eat that is matzah, just like certain korbanot in the Beit HaMikdash or Truma Maisa, that's only with matzah. So matzah is a huge mitzvah, and I want to talk a little bit about the mitzvah of matzah. So I want to start by talking about what matzot should we be eating. What matzot should we be eating? So it's very interesting. We all know how to make matzah. That is, we take flour and water, and that's it. A pretty simple recipe, flour and water. There is a way to make a kosher type of matzah, which doesn't have flour and water only in it. That's a matzah where instead of using water, a person would use another juice. For example, wine or eggs or fruit juice. That would make a much sweeter dough. And in fact, our matzah of flour and water is called, and we say it on Seder night, lechem oni, the poor man's bread. But if you make matzah with flour and wine, or flour and egg the juice of the eggs, or flour and orange juice, then you would have not lechem oni, but what the rabbis call lechem matzah ashira, not the poor man's bread, but the rich matzah, because it's rich in taste. Now, the Gemara says a very interesting thing. The flour and water will rise, and therefore you have to bake it really quickly. We all know within 18 minutes. There are lots of things that you have to do to make sure your matzah doesn't rise. But apparently, says the Gemara, if you're not using any water at all, that is, if you're only using flour and fruit juice, then it won't rise and it'll be fine. That's called matzah ashira. So let's start by saying that you can make a kosher Pesach matzah ashira. The Ashkenazim, it's mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch in the Ramah, the Ashkenazim have a custom not to eat such matzah during the whole days of Pesach, unless there is a health reason, if you're old or sick, and there's a reason why you need to eat that because you're unwell and you need to eat it for health reasons. You can't stand normal matzah. You need to eat it for health reasons. Then the Ashkenazim permit it. The Sfarim, the Shulchan Aruch, permits it for everyone. Word of warning, consumer warning, they actually make matzah and some cookies and some cakes called matzah ashira. It's pure 100% kosher Pesach flour, and then instead of mixing it with water, it's mixed with wine or fruit juice. Ashkenazim should refrain from such matzah for the whole days. But you can keep it in your house. It's not chametz. You can keep it in your house, but we don't eat it unless we're sick or special dispensations of people who really need it. Unfortunately, that's usually written on the box, on the label, in tiny letters in Hebrew, right underneath the heksha. In Rashi Tevot, it says something like Lain, Shua, Ramah, Tufka, and unless you happen to be walking through your supermarket with a whole Shulchan Aruch on hand and a microscope to see these little letters, you might miss that out. But things that are sold as egg matzahs or cookies that are sold usually with a Sfadi heksha as matzah ashira, that Ashkenazi should refrain from. What about Sfadim? Apparently Sfadim can have it, but even they can't use it for Seder night. They can't use it for the mitzvah matzah. The matzahs that we eat during the Seder for the mitzvah, they must be lechem oni. I'll just add one more word about matzah ashira, and that is, Baruch Hashem, in the modern generations, in our times, we merit to have a whole nother halachic argument about this stuff. Not just the argument between the Sfadim and the Ashkenazim about whether you should have it the whole week, but a machloket between the Sfadim themselves. Rav Avadia Yosef, of blessed memory, he actually gave his heksha to a whole type of cookies of matzah ashira that were made with kosher Pesach flour and wine. Rab Mordechai Eliyahu Zatzal held that because there are additives and other things that are placed, and preservatives and other things that are placed in these cookies to make them, to manufacture them in the modern manufacturing processes, he believed that they were not matzah ashira at all, but they were chametz gamur. And that's a big machloket in the Sephardi world about whether the matzah ashira that is commercially sold under the hekshas of Rav Avadia Yosef Zatzal or his children, according to that half of the Sephardi world, is mahadrin, and according to Rav Mordechai Eliyahu and that half of the Sephardi world, it's chametz gamur, and you shouldn't even keep it in your house. Okay, so we talked first about matzah ashira. Everyone, Sephardim and Ashkenazim, together are going to agree that you can't use that for Seder night. Next, so what matzahs should we use? The Torah tells us that you should guard the matzot. This is kind of difficult because we have to guard everything we eat during Pesach to make sure it doesn't become chametz. We've already been told in the Torah that you're not allowed to have any chametz, not allowed to see any chametz, and certainly not allowed to eat any chametz. So what is this extra law that we're being told to guard the matzahs? So there's a machloket rishonim about what that actually means. But when it gets to the Shulchan Aruch, we have three major opinions. The opinions are talking about that we should guard the process of making the matzahs for the sake of the mitzvah. That is, we should guard that when we're making the matzahs, we should do it with the intention that the matzahs that we're creating should be mitzvah matzahs. There are three different opinions about at what stage of the process do we have to have that in mind. No one thinks you need to have that in mind when you plant the seeds to grow the wheat. The first and strictest opinion says you need to have that in mind from the time you harvest the wheat. From the time you harvest the grain, it should be harvested with the intent of making matzahs. You can imagine this is going to send the price skyrocketing. You have to send Jews with kippahs and payas down out to the fields, and they have to harvest, or at least supervise the harvesting of the wheat, and it should be cut for the sake of making matzahs. That is the strictest opinion in the Shulchan Aruch, and it's what you and me call today shmura matzah, matzah shmura, matzah that's been guarded from the time of harvesting. The second opinion says you don't need to guard it from the time of harvesting. It's enough to guard it from the time of grinding the wheat into flour. That is, you can take normal wheat that you imported from, I don't know, the middle of South America, came on a boat, got to Israel. It's dry, it hasn't been wet. And now when you take the wheat from the silo and you take it to the place where you're going to grind it into flour, it needs to be ground for the sake of making flour that will be used to make mitzvah matzah. That's what you and me today call normal kosher Pesach matzahs. That's what they sell under the name of kosher Pesach matzahs. All the matzahs that they make everywhere that are kosher for Pesach are made with the intention that it should be for eating on Seder night, even though they know that a lot of them will be eaten in Chol HaMoed, and some of them might even be eaten before or after Pesach. And they make them all with the intention that they should all be fitting to be used for mitzvah matzah from the time they ground the wheat. Third opinion, you don't have to do it from the time of harvesting. That was the strictest one. And neither from the time of grinding. That was the next opinion. Rather, only from the time of kneading the dough. According to this, you could use normal flour from the marketplace. And just when you added the water to it, at that point, you would have to say, this is for the sake of making matzah for the mitzvah. We don't actually rely upon this opinion today. Maybe if a person is lost in the middle of India and they can't get matzahs somewhere, I mean, can't imagine that would happen. I mean, you stand lost it's probably a good way if you get lost in the middle of the Sahara Desert and it's Erev Pesach, and you think to yourself, oh, I'll just take regular flour from the shop here and mix it with water and make my own kosher Pesach matzahs, relying on the most lenient opinion. So no, here's how you get rescued. You just yell out in a loud voice, I'm a Jew and need matzahs, and for sure a Chabadnik will come along and give you free shmura matzahs and take you out of there. We don't rely on that opinion today because we're afraid that the normal flour that we might purchase just in the shop all year long might have been washed or bleached in the commercial cleaning process of making flour. And so we're not 100% sure that our flours haven't become in contact with water, and that would be problematic. So for practical concerns, we don't. That's what the Mishnah Berurah writes, and it's quoted even up until modern day on like the OU website. Even today, I'm not familiar with the processing of normal flour today, and if there's a difference between organic flour or whole wheat flour or normal flour, I'm not particular with all the details, but they quote this opinion that you should worry, that was mentioned already more than 100 years ago, that you should worry that our normal commercial flour is already chametz, so we don't rely upon that. So that means that on Seder night, you should use shmura matzah, and we have two opinions of what shmura is. Opinion number one, what you and me call shmura, that is matzah that was made for the sake of mitzvah matzah from the time of harvesting. The second opinion, the more lenient opinion, is just what you and me call regular matzahs, which is shmura according to the opinion that from the time of grinding. If you possibly can, you should spend the money and you should buy shmura matzahs minimally for the mitzvahs you're going to do on Seder night. That is enough to give each person at the Seder a kazayit, two kazayit, what we're going to talk about, the amount you need to eat for the first eating, for korech, and for afikomen. There are many Jews who are careful to eat shmura matzah for all the Seder. And then there are some Jews who are particular to eat shmura matzah for the whole of the 7 days or 8 days of Pesach in Chutz La'aretz. That is, that a person who can might want to take on that chumrah. But according to regular halacha, normative mainstream halacha, a person is certainly allowed to use what we call regular matzahs for all of Pesach, even for the Shabbos and Yom Tov meals. But for Seder night, for the mitzvahs that they're doing at the beginning of the meal, achilat matzah, korach, and afikomen, they should make a big effort to get what we call shmura matzah. If you couldn't get that and you just got regular matzah, you can certainly rely on the opinion in the Shulchan Aruch that that can be used to fulfill the mitzvah. And that leads us now with the next question. Should you use machine or hand matzahs? So we know that when we left Egypt, the dough didn't rise before the Holy One, blessed be He, revealed Himself to us and redeemed us. And that's why we eat matzah. They used handmade matzah, no doubt about it. When machines started coming into use, now more than 100 years ago, when machines started coming into use, there was major arguments in the rabbinic world about whether you could use machine matzahs for the mitzvah. Can you use machine matzahs for the mitzvah on Seder night? There were two questions about that. The first question is, can you actually make kosher matzah with a machine? What's the problem? Well, the machines, as they work, the dough goes in, and there's mechanical rollers and presses and makes holes, and it's like an assembly line. If a little bit of dough gets stuck in there and doesn't go into the oven, after 18 minutes, that dough is going to rise. What happens if some of that dough falls into the next batch? Then all your matzahs are problematic. The early machines were very difficult to clean every 18 minutes. If truth be told, the modern machines are incredibly clean. They have high pressure air sprays in them, and they're made of pure stainless steel, and they manage to make them in such a way that it's very unlikely that any crumbs get from one batch to the other. They clean them out very regularly, less than every 18 minutes, and they're very clean. And but that was one problem. Historically, it was a bigger problem than it is today. Today, most people, from what I've heard, think that the machines today are very good, at least as good as human beings, in being able to keep kosher and not have any chametz from one to the other. What's the other problem? The other problem is intention. We mentioned that the matzah has to be made with the intention that they should be used for mitzvah matzah. We said there were 3 opinions about when you need that intention, but everyone agrees that you need that at the time of baking. Some people say you need it also at the time of kneading. Some people go back and say you need it at the time of grinding. And some people go back and say you need it at the time of harvesting. But everyone agrees you need it at the time of baking. I was, last week, I had the pleasure of baking my own matzahs. And we started off our session of baking in the morning by everyone involved making a declaration. I hereby declare that everything I do today is for the sake of making matzahs to be eaten for the mitzvah of matzah on Pesach. And then throughout the morning of baking, people would yell out, l'shem, right, for the sake of making matzahs for the mitzvah. can you do that with a machine? We know that machines don't have intent. So can you make intentional matzahs made with kavanah by a machine? Those people who say that you can only use handmade matzahs would say that a machine cannot have intent. Even if you can get kosher matzahs from a machine, which most people today say you can, they would say the machine has no intent, so it doesn't work. And the rabbis who say you can use machine matzahs, they say the person who turns the machine on has intent. And when they turn the machine on, they say, this is for the sake of making matzahs. And they push the button. And that creates intent. What's the difference between turning the machine on and the long pole that you use to stick when you're making handmade matzahs to put the dough into the oven? The pole doesn't have intention. Only the person standing behind the pole has intention. So here too, the machine has no intention. The person standing behind the button has intention. Other rabbis argue and say that only works if there's a human being actually pedaling the machine the whole time. But if you just pushed a button and you allowed the electricity to run the machine, then you went and sat down and you learned Parshat Shavua. You went to the Nishmat Yom Iyun on Pesach, and you weren't involved in the matzah making at all. So how can your first act of turning the machine on help for 25 minutes later, for 2 hours later? There are arguments on both sides. Certainly, the Jewish people are holy, and everyone is fulfilling the mitzvah, both with handmade and with machine matzahs, in my opinion. There were great rabbis in Jerusalem in the 1900s who believed that you should only use machine matzahs. They believed they're on a much higher standard of kashrut and that you should use machine matzahs. And many of the great rabbis in the early 1900s in Jerusalem specifically used machine matzahs. But most of the people who wanted to be strict used handmade matzahs. So let's summarize. What type of matzahs should you be using? Should you use machine or handmade matzahs? Well, you can follow your family tradition there, or you can either one. You would fulfill your obligation, in my opinion. If you don't have it this way or that way, and you have a choice and you have enough money, then probably handmade matzahs is fulfilling the mitzvah according to more opinions. But if you end up at a Seder where they're using machine matzahs, you don't have to feel bad about it. You fulfilled the mitzvah, and according to some rabbis, you either did the mitzvah in the best way, and there were great rabbis who used machine matzahs. So where have we got to so far? Quick summary. We've got to the point that neither Ashkenazim nor Sephardim are using matzah ashira. We're all using lechem oni, that is, we're using matzah that's made out of flour and water. Next, we are using shmura matzah. Which matzah is shmura matzah? Either what we call today shmura matzah, which is much more expensive, but if you have to use what we call today regular matzah, there is such an opinion that you fulfill your obligation using regular matzahs, but a person should try very hard to use shmura matzahs at least for the mitzvah on Seder night, the first, middle, and last eating. And then we talked about should be using hand or machine matzahs, and we said that there is a halachic argument about it. There are probably more rabbis on the hand matzah side than there are on the machine matzah side, but there are very big rabbis on the machine matzah side, and a person can fulfill their obligation with machine matzahs. Certainly, if that's what your parents did and you want to do that, you can feel good doing machine matzahs. Now I want to talk about Sephardi or Ashkenazi matzahs. Most people in the what we call the modern world for the last several hundred years have been using very, very thin matzahs that crack and break, that have the consistency of crackers, that are very, very thin. They're only a millimeter or so thin, 2 millimeters, something, very, very thin matzahs. Why do we do that? The reason we use very, very thin matzahs is because there's very little chance that any chametz will remain in them. Probably many of you have had the experience of baking a challah or a cake and cutting it only to discover that the middle portion wasn't cooked enough until you get your cooking skills up. That can happen. So the thicker the bread is, the more chance that there could remain inside a part that the heat didn't get to, and therefore did not get hot enough to stop the leavening process. And that would be very problematic if we took the matzah out of the oven and inside there was a part that wasn't fully baked. It would continue to ferment and become chametz. So therefore, we started this practice of eating very, very thin matzahs. That's what the Ramah writes. According to the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch, you can make matzahs up to a tefach. A tefach is from here to here, the size of a person's hand, and that is somewhere between 8 and 10 centimeters. So theoretically, you could make your matzahs really thick. The Ramah says, no, our custom is to make them much thinner, and we make thin matzahs. And that is the practice in the Jewish world today, is to make thin matzahs. How thin is thin matzahs? The commentators on the Ramah, on the Shulchan Aruch there, say that's the size of a thumb, the width of a person's thumb. Wow. We don't have matzahs that's like thicker than a pita. We don't have matzahs that thick. Our matzahs are only, like we mentioned, a few millimeters thick. Having said all that, there is a tradition amongst many of the Sfardim to make soft matzahs. How do you make soft matzahs? Well, it depends on how much water you add to the flour, how much you leave them in the oven for. But the Sfardim make kosher Pesach thin. They're thin because they're no bigger than a thumb width. They make thin matzahs that are soft. This, in the modern world, has become popular because in order to keep them soft, after you bake them, you need to freeze them immediately. And then on Seder night, you take them out and you put them on top of the soup or something. You put them on the platter about 20 minutes before you want to eat them and about half an hour before, and then they thaw out, but they don't become crispy. They stay soft and palatable. Now, until everyone had freezers in their house and was able to freeze these, this was like a non-starter unless you were making your own matzahs. And because the Ashkenazim had a tradition, certainly not to make matzahs during Pesach and certainly not on Seder night, this was just a non-starter. We just didn't have the technical means to do it. The Sfardim they had a tradition that they would bake their matzahs all the way during Pesach. Every day during Pesach, they would make fresh matzahs like they did in the time of the Gemara, and which is certainly halachically acceptable. The Ashkenazim just didn't do it because we wanted to be extra careful. So, but in the modern world that now we do have freezers, they've been making these soft matzahs already for weeks and weeks and freezing them in industrial freezers, and you can order them and get them delivered to your house, and they put them straight in your freezer. And like we said, you take them out before Seder night and eat them. So can Ashkenazim and Sfardim alike have that? Well, Sfardim for sure can use them because many Sephardi communities had such a tradition. They for sure can eat them. I'll just add in brackets that it makes it much, much, much easier to eat a large volume of matzah because there's just more volume, there's more dough in each bite that you're chewing and eating. If you've made it long and thin, then you have to actually take more bites and chew a much, much bigger area to get the same volume of matzah in your tummy. So the Sfardim who eat soft matzahs are able to eat bigger measures of matzah in a much shorter time. But that's just in brackets. That explains why you see some Sephardi rabbis like Rav Mordechai Eliyahu Zatzal, who we mentioned previously, previous Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel, who has very, very large measures of how big a kazayit is. And the reason is because he ate soft matzahs and it was much easier for him to eat and swallow that. Can Ashkenazim eat soft matzahs? So Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal, the great Ashkenazi poskim of Jerusalem, died in the modern era. He is quoted as saying that, no, it's not our tradition. and you should follow our tradition and eat crispy, crunchy matzahs like your fathers and grandfathers did. And certainly there is something in that, eating matzahs in the same way that our fathers and grandfathers and Ashkenazim have done for generations and generations. It's true, we probably can go back 500 years, 1,000 years, however long back we want to go, and find Ashkenazim who also had soft matzahs. At some point, we were all doing what they did in the Gemara, which was making fresh matzah every day because there was just no way to store anything. But already for hundreds, if not 1,000 years, Ashkenazim have had have had hard, crunchy matzahs, and there is something to be said for keeping our practices, our traditions. On the other hand, after I've quoted Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach with all due honor, it seems to me that it's very hard to halachically forbid Ashkenazim for fulfilling the mitzvah with soft kosher Pesach matzahs. So if you're invited to a Sephardi Seder, and they have these, or you have difficulty eating hard matzah, or there is some other reason why you wanted to swap to soft matzah, I would find it hard to forbid it, and it might even be the correct thing to do in order to be able to fulfill the mitzvah, and certainly in order to be able to, if that's you're at a Sephardi Seder and that's what they serve you, for sure that's you should do the mitzvah, unless you bought your own matzahs and they don't mind, but you can certainly fulfill the mitzvah on their matzahs. That being said, I will say again, as an Ashkenazi, I follow the opinion of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and I eat the same matzahs that my father and grandfather and great-grandfather ate, the crunchy stuff. Okay, next and last question about which matzahs we should be eating. Today, there's a plethora of matzahs on the market made out of all different types of grains. There are 5 grains that are mentioned by our rabbis as being things that can become chametz. That is wheat, barley, rye, oats, and spelt. Only those 5 grains, which can the theoretical possibility of becoming chametz, only those 5 grains can be used to make matzah. So you can only make matzah out of wheat, barley, rye, oats, and spelt. So someone who wants to make rice matzah, the Gemara considers that option. And there was one rabbi in the Gemara who actually believed that rice was one of the grains, the 5 grain, well, according to him, he had 6 grains, but the halacha is not like him. It's very clear in the Mishnah that only 5 grains. So if you want to make rice or use African teff or to use any other type of grain, corn, it's not going to work. You want to make a taco matzah, you didn't fulfill your mitzvah, and it's no good. However, I see today that there are sold matzahs made out of all those 5 grains. When I was young, the only matzahs that you could buy were wheat matzah. Standard matzah is made from wheat flour. But today, because there are many people who have problems digesting wheat, there are people who have all types of gluten sensitivity, and so they make matzahs out of oats that don't have any gluten in them. They also make matzahs out of rye and spelt. You can buy pretty much any type of the 5 grain matzahs. Of course, we would only have to be talking about matzahs that were made under supervision for the mitzvah. Hopefully, if you wanted to do it the best way, you would have to get shmura matzahs made out of these 5 grains. But even the regular matzahs made out of these 5 grains, we said, if you needed to, you could fulfill your mitzvah with them. However, the Ramah writes that wheat is the first in the list, and it is the best of the grains. It is the highest on the list, and it's the preferred grain. And therefore, a person should go to do their mitzvahs with the matzahs made out of wheat flour. Now, if you have any medical issues and it's hard for you to use wheat flour and you won't be able to do the mitzvahs properly, or it's going to cause you great pain, then go ahead. That's why these rabbis went to such trouble to figure out how to make gluten-free oat matzahs and how to make rye matzahs and spelt matzahs. That's why they did it. They did it for you, so you could do the mitzvot and do Pesach properly. But for those people who have no problems and can eat matzah, regular wheat matzah, there is certainly a halachic preference to fulfill the mitzvahs on Seder night with the regular wheat matzahs. So if you wanted to just try and be unusual this year and say, oh, this year we're doing spelt matzahs, no, probably not a good idea. You fulfilled your mitzvah, but not in the best way. Okay, now let's go and talk about how much matzah you should eat. So from the Torah, a person only has to eat a kazayit of matzah. We'll have to talk about how big a kazayit is. From the Torah, a person only has to eat a kazayit of matzah. And if a person is really can only eat minimal amount of food, they have digestive problems, they're unable to eat food, they don't know, in jail in Siberia, and they can only get a minimal amount of matzah, then a person should go to eat just one kazayit. If you're only eating one kazayit, that should be done at the end of the meal for afikomen. That is, a person should eat their maror and at the beginning of the meal, and then eat their meal, and only towards the end of the meal, when they finish, wash, and then say hamotzi alachilat matzah, eat a kazayit of matzah, and they eat nothing after it, because after you've eaten your mitzvah matzah, at the end of the meal, you have to have matzah in your mouth and not eat anything after it. So a person who is limited because of medical or physical restraints, and he's only allowed to eat one kazayit of matzah, they should speak to the rabbi about how to do it. They're going to do it in a strange way by washing at the end of the meal and having their kazayit before benching. But all the rest of us who can eat normal matzah and eat matzah regularly, we are going to do what the rabbi said, which is not to rely on one kazayit. We're going to actually eat matzah 3 times. We're going to eat it at the beginning of the meal. We're going to eat it then again after maror in the Hillel sandwich in Korach. And then we're going to eat it again at the end of the meal for afikomen. Let's go through those. Let's start with the first eating. The first eating, we say in the 2 brachot, hamotzi lechem min haaretz and alachilat matzah. At that point, you really only need to eat one kazayit. But the Shulchan Aruch writes in the name of the Rosh that a person should eat 2 kazayitim, one from the matzah that says hamotzi, and one from the matzah that you said on it, alachilat matzah. All the latter-day rabbis have difficulty understanding why that is so. To eat a kazayit for alachilat matzah, on the mitzvah of eating matzah, we understand. But why do you need to eat a kazayit for hamotzi? Why do you need another kazayit? And they come up with all types of answers. Let me suffice to say that a person who has no difficulty eating matzah should do what the Shulchan Aruch says and eat 2 kazayitim for the beginning of the meal. But a person who knows that eating 2 kazayitim at the beginning of the meal is going to be difficult for them and cause them not to be able to eat maror and Hillel sandwich and afikomen in the correct way, or cause them discomfort, they are certainly halachically allowed to eat 1 kazayit at the beginning of the meal. This is all the more true if you were not the person who held the matzot and said the brachot on them and are getting your kazayitim from the 3 matzahs in the middle of the Seder plate. Probably one of the reasons why the Shulchan Aruch says to eat 2 kazayitim is because he's not sure whether the top matzah or the middle matzah is the one that we need to eat a kazayit from. And therefore, we should eat a kazayit from the top and the middle one. However, most of us today don't actually get a kazayit from the top and the middle one. And if you're lucky, the head of the household who said the brachot will give you a little piece from the top and the middle one, and then you'll have a big pile of matzot in the middle of the table, which you will add for your measure. So you don't have any doubt. You don't have a problem of which matzah did I say the bracha on, which one do I need to eat a kazayit from. I'm eating a kazayit from the big pile in the middle, not from the ones that the bracha was specifically set on. In such a case, says Rav Moshe Feinstein and other rabbis, it's enough to eat only 1 kazayit. Okay, so we said how many kazayitim should you eat? Ideally, you should eat two kazetim at the beginning. But if that's difficult, it's hard, and especially if you're not eating it from the matzot that the blessings were set on, you can make do with one kazait. For the Hillel sandwich, korech, you need another kazait. And it's important to point out that it's a real mitzvah to eat korech. We say in it in memory that Hillel did in the time when the temple stood. He took matzah, maror, and Pesach and ate them together. But it's not just a fond memory. It's actually a rabbinic mitzvah. And like all mitzvot, it needs a measure. So it's a rabbinic mitzvah. The first eating was from the Torah. This is a rabbinic mitzvah, but you certainly need a kazayit of matzah and a kazayit of maror. Then for afikomen, you only need a kazayit. But several Latter-day rabbis, the Bach and others, say here too it's good to eat two kazaitim. Why? Because there are opinions that say that the afikomen is not just in memory of the Korban Pesach that was eaten at the end of the evening, but it's also the time when the temple stood that we used to eat mitzvah matzah. We used to eat it together with the Pesach, and that was at the end of the meal. So maybe what we're eating here now is mitzvah matzah. If that's true, we need two kazetim, one for the memory of the Pesach and one for the mitzvah matzah that was eaten with it. So if a person possibly can, they should eat two kazetim for afikomen. But again, that's a chumrah, and if it's difficult for you, you can get by with one kazait. So let's summarize. At the beginning of the meal, you should have at least one kazait, and if you want to be strict, two. For korech, you have one kazait, and for afikomen, you need to have one kazait, and if you want to be strict, you can have two. Now all we've got to do is figure out how big a kazait is. Our time is very short. There are many opinions about this. I'll tell you the major ones. The major ones is that a kazait is somewhere between a third and a half of a piece of matzah. So it'd be very good if at the beginning of the meal, a person had somewhere between 2/3, maybe 3/4, and some people say even one whole piece of matzah. I'm giving you the measurements in machine matzahs because all machine matzahs are similar. If you're going to eat it in handmade matzahs, then each one is slightly different and it's hard to give a regular size, but you can try and take the measures from here over to there. They say in the name of the Chazon Ish that a kazait of matzah is the size of the palm of your hand without the thumb, so about that big. So if you put that on your handmade matzah, your hand on the handmade matzah, it's a good way to remember it. You've got one kazait. So if you can eat two at the beginning, that would be wonderful. For korech, you only need one kazait, and it's only rabbinic, so you're good. Only eating a third of a matzah. Some people go even a bit less than that. And for afikomen, again, a third. Some people go up to and say it's good to eat 2/3 or 3/4 of a piece of matzah then. You should remember that there are opinions who say that every bite you take is another mitzvah. And so it's good not to be skimpy on this. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful mitzvah. A person who has eating difficulties and a person who knows that eating large quantities of matzah is going to give them pain, please be in contact with your local rabbi. And feel free, you can call me up or be in contact with me too, because there are certainly measures that are much smaller than the measures I just mentioned now, which are for good, healthy people and people who have difficulty eating and who have digestional problems or any other issues. There are much more lenient opinions for times of need. We should merit this Pesach especially to have the blessings of freedom bestowed upon the Jewish people wherever they are. We should merit that all the hostages come home soon and get to sit at their seders with their families in good health here in Eretz Israel. We should merit that all the soldiers that are doing such an incredible job for Am Yisrael should continue to have Hashem's blessing with every success and should be guarded, and they should also all come home safely. And we should merit the Jews in Israel and all over the world should merit that we should bring the blessings of freedom into the world, that Hashem should bestow them upon us, and from through the Jewish people should come out to all the nations, and we should all merit to be L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim Habenuyah. Shalom Uvracha.
Wow, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today at our annual Yom Iyun for Pesach, dedicated to the memory of Marley Sherman. Um, we heard a little bit about Hashem's greater plan and things in general. We heard about Achdut of Am Yisrael, building the Mikdash, and about what it actually means to be free. And then about practicalities of halachot, of eating matzah, what kind of matzah, and in these turbulent times, it's Vehisha Amda. Vehisha Amda, it's thank God the Torah has always been the light and that spark that we hold on to always. It and Baruch Hashem, whether it's on Zoom and online or in any of our programming or in the Beit Midrash and Nishmat or in Yerushalayim, thank God the light of the Torah is what just keeps us going every generation. And Amir Hashem, exactly as Rav Sperling said, and as has been said here, that we should all just have peace, Amir Hashem, Am Yisrael, in Eretz Yisrael, in every place they are, that our hostages should be back safe before Pesach, and that all our soldiers should be safe everywhere they are, and all of Am Yisrael, Amir Hashem. Everyone should have a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, and thank you for joining us today.